Close your eyes, let your body settle, and drift into the dim grey mist of a medieval morning. The rooster crows, not as a peaceful signal, but more like a reminder that today will be exactly as hungry as the one before. It's a damp morning in a thatch-roofed cottage somewhere in 13th century England. Rain from the night before has leaked through the straw above, soaking the floor, and waking a weary family before dawn. And whatever leftover greens or weeds could be gathered from the roadside, this early meal is more survival than sustenance. No sugar, no salt, no meat. Just a flavorless, glue-like slop, eaten day after day. It's warm, and that's all it needs to do. There is no such thing as a comforting breakfast. No smell of coffee, no fresh bread, no warmth of eggs or fruit or milk. A long day of labor awaits. Digging, harvesting, tending animals. And breakfast will have to last. There won't be another substantial bite until the sun is nearly down, but no one complains. Complaining doesn't put food in the bowl. And listen to the fire crackle softly as we move into the next chapter of this medieval meal story. The same pottage that fed their parents now feeds them. If they're lucky, they'll live long enough to feed it to their children, too. Instead, the peasant mother stirs a pot over a weak fire, filled with a slow, grey substance. It is called pottage, and it is the beginning and end of what most medieval peasants knew as food, made from water, a handful of oats, or barley if lucky, and what's there might have been stored in a damp sack for weeks, occasionally moldy, but too precious to waste. In the corner, a child chews on yesterday's crust of rye bread. So hard it needs to be soaked in pottage to become chewable. The body needs fuel, and the fuel is barely possible. Hunger is constant, a dull ache carried through the seasons. Fullness is rare and celebrated. Bread for peasants wasn't soft or pleasant. It was dense, coarse, and often made from flour mixed with chalk, beans, or even sawdust, to stretch the supply. It filled the stomach but wore down the teeth. There is no choice in this kitchen. No menu, no meal prep, no decisions to make. You eat what's there, or you go without. In this world, food is not about enjoyment. It is a battle of endurance. Outdoors, the fields beckon. As the fire dims and the family heads out into the fog, the taste of breakfast already forgotten, the rhythm of survival begins again. Slow, heavy, and hungry. Let your mind rest in the silence of that cold, dark cottage. Let your breath slow as we stroll into the heart of a medieval town. It's market day. The stone streets are slick with mud and waste. There are no neat displays, no plastic gloves, no stainless steel counters. Instead, we find rows of wooden stalls, crooked and splintered, set out beneath faded cloth awnings. The air is heavy, not with the scent of fresh produce, but with the unmistakable stench of blood, decay, and damp straw. This is where meat is bought, if you can afford it. The butcher's stall is not refrigerated, of course. There are no ice blocks, no cooling systems. He wipes it on his apron, on the stallwood, or simply dips it in a bucket of murky water. If you're not, it might kill you by morning. There's no such thing as food safety. People die from bad meat all the time, but no one connects it to bacteria. The cause is blamed on the stars, on bad humors, or sometimes even on sin. Life presses on, and food, no matter how dangerous, must be eaten. As the scent of butcher's day fades into memory, instead, slabs of animal carcasses hang from rusty hooks or lie sprawled on wooden boards crawling with flies. In the winter, it freezes. Salt is expensive. Vinegar, even more so. For most people, preservation means hope. Hope that the mold won't spread too far before supper. The clamor of the market is behind us, and the quiet hush of sacred stone cloisters begins to settle around you like a soft woolen blanket. You step through a heavy wooden door, its iron hinges creaking as you enter the inner sanctum of a medieval monastery, a world apart from the filthy bustle of town life, and that the maggots haven't settled too deep. Stray dogs lurk nearby, licking at the drips on the cobblestones. No laughing, no chatting, just the soft scrape of spoons in cauldrons, and the whisper of sandals on stone floors. Sometimes cheese, if there were cows or goats. Occasionally, on feast days, a bit of fresh fish, or even meat, but never for all. Instead, one monk read from scripture aloud, while the others ate in silence, chewing slowly, hands folded between bites. Their gardens were carefully tended. Herbs like sage, rosemary, and hyssop were grown for both medicine and cooking. Bees provided honey, one of the only sources of sweetness available. Grains were milled on site, Ale was brewed in stone barrels. It was a quiet economy of survival. This was not a place to savor food. It was a place to endure it. Only the abbot or sickly brethren might be allowed extra portions, but as necessity, something to be approached with restraint, even suspicion. Many abbeys fed the poor, pottage ladled out from steaming iron pots at the gatehouse, thin but warm, a lifeline in the harsh winter months. It becomes clear. For the monks food was not comfort but duty, a part of their devotion. Monks didn't eat well by modern standards, but compared to peasants, they fared decently. Their food was at least clean, their bread not stretched with sawdust, or nearly half the calendar. During Lent, no meat was allowed at all, only fish, if it could be found, or thin, pottage, beans, and bread. Gluttony was a sin. Eating too much was a failure of the soul, so monks fasted, often liver, heart, kidneys, sometimes lungs, or even boiled pig's feet. The rich feast on venison and swan. The poor get what the Lord's The smell is sour, tangy, sharp, a mixture of iron-rich blood, rotting fat, and unwashed hands. The meat is rarely fresh. Animals are slaughtered near dawn, and by mid-morning, the decay has already begun. In the summer, meat spoils quickly. For example, aquatic animals were allowed on fasting days, and the definition of aquatic was sometimes stretched to absurd lengths. Beavers, considered fish. Otters, also fish. Even barnacle geese, which were believed to grow on driftwood in the sea, were deemed acceptable for Lent. Others mix spoiled meat into stew, letting it simmer until the sourness dulls, and still others simply hold their breath and chew quickly. Many families can't afford meat at all, but when they do, they get the scraps. Stringy cuts, gristle, organ meat. The butcher's knife is rarely clean. If you're lucky, the meat tastes only slightly off. There are no labels, no expiration dates, only color, smell, and superstition to guide you. Some sprinkle herbs to mask the taste of rot. All this effort for what might be your only bite of protein this week. But still, the meat market bustles. Housewives haggle, children dart between carts, cats prowl under benches. So, let yourself imagine the soft shuffle of shoes on wet stone, the distant clatter of hooves and wheels, and the murmuring of 1,000 barters. In our next segment, we'll step into the flickering candlelight of a where food served a different purpose entirely. It is twilight now. This is a place of discipline, of silence, and of hunger. Monks lived by strict rules. In many orders, especially under the rule of Saint Benedict, food was seen not as pleasure. Depending on the time of year in the order, fasting days might be twice a week. But here's where it gets strange. Within the strict confines of monastic discipline, there were curious loopholes. In the monastery kitchens, cold spaces with high-beamed ceilings and soot-blackened hearths, simple meals were prepared in silence. The food was plain, coarse, rye bread, bean stew, onions, and lentils. Meals were eaten communally in the refectory. Long wooden tables stretched under dim candlelight. No one spoke. Still, monasteries were among the few places in the medieval world with structured agriculture. For those outside the monastery walls, monastic food was a blessing. And as you sit now in the glow of a flickering candle listening to the faint echo of Latin prayers and wooden spoons on pewter bowls, so take a breath, deep and slow, and feel the stillness of these stone walls. In the next segment, we'll venture beyond, to the homes of peasants, where hunger was not sacred, but constant. Now, let us step out of the cloisters, out of their cold stone order and gentle silence, and walk slowly down a muddy village lane. The air is damp. The earth smells of manure and smoke. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks, a child coughs, and from a thatched cottage ahead, a thin ribbon of smoke curls up into the grey sky. You approach the doorway. There is no door, only a woven cloth, darkened with soot. You lift it and stoop to enter. Above, bundles of herbs and strips of dried root vegetables hang from the rafters, and often it is barely food at all. You see a pile of firewood, some baskets of barley and beans, and in the center of the room, the low-burning hearth, its smoke barely escaping through a crude chimney hole in the thatch, or porridge. It varied. A pot hung over the fire all day, into which went whatever was on hand. Beans, peas, oats, leeks, onion tops, a sprig of parsley if the season allowed. The base was often water or milk, thickened with oats or barley, and flavored very gently with salt, if available, or mashed roots, anything to make the loaf larger. Root vegetables might rot in the cellar. Grain stores could be spoiled by rats. A woman might trade a bowl of pottage for firewood. A man might swap a few eggs for a pint of weak ale. And on feast days a communal pig might be slaughtered and shared. A rare moment of plenty. The air smells of smoke and onions. The pottage is hot, but thin. You eat slowly, chewing carefully around the bit of bone floating near the bottom. And a poor harvest meant hard hunger. But it is warm, it is real. And for now, tonight, it is enough. This is a peasant's home. It is dark inside, even during the day. The floor is dirt, uneven and damp. A few rough stools stand near the hearth. A deer or boar may have hung for days, even weeks, before reaching the fire. A noble rot was considered part of the flavor. Fowl might be stuffed with herbs and dried fruit to mask the sourness. Fish arrived from coastal markets smelling of brine and thyme, preserved in layers of salt that had to be scraped and rinsed repeatedly. Dinner, which came midday, would center around the eternal staple pottage. Yet they were eaten lavishly. Water was not clean. It was to disguise decay. Medieval cooks were masters of distraction. They were a sign of status, but they also masked the scent of rancid fat or meat turned gray. They could make a piece of questionable lamb taste bold, exotic, even delicious. Right before it gave you food poisoning, bowls were not washed. Copper pots bubble on the fire. There are sacks of almonds, barrels of wine, jugs of imported oil, and strings of onions and garlic hanging like trophies. There were no expiration dates. Meat could be full of parasites, gout, diarrhea, vomiting, cramps, and fevers. The price of luxury was pain. Grains might be water was almost never clean. And yet this was the height of cuisine. Rats, mold, flies. They were the unseen dinner guests. Meat went bad. Fruit fermented. Pies were left out, unwrapped, often swarming with bugs by morning. Tables were set with trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as edible plates. And at the end of it all, the leftover trenchers soaked in grease and sauce were sometimes collected and distributed to the poor. The food piled high, roast swan stuffed with herbs and pork, eel pies, jellied fish, capon soaked in wine, custards made from eggs and almond milk. You sit quietly, watching a lord tear into a roast, unaware that his next bite might bring him to bed for a week. The food is impressive, yes, but it is also risky, unstable, and deeply misunderstood. It looked grand, it tasted curious, it smelled of spice and sugar and meat just past its prime. Vegetables were not peeled. Food could be moldy, fermented, spoiled, or simply unsafe. Diarrhea and dysentery were constant threats. This is where food is made. Hands were wiped on tablecloths or on the fur trim of a cloak. They told stories, they said prayers, they endured. For the medieval peasant, meals were rarely varied. Breakfast might be a crust, of course, rye bread, dunked in weak ale, rye or barley flour, sometimes mixed with bean flour, lentil meal, or even in desperate times, ground bark or powdered peas. We leave behind the pottage pot and cracked wooden bowls, and pass through a different world entirely, a world of stone corridors, high ceilings, and roaring hearths. The air grows warmer, but not more comfortable. The smells are stronger here. Roasted meat, old grease, spoiled fruit, wine gone to vinegar, and something acrid lingering in the corners. The bread might be sour, hard, or gritty. It was filling, not delicious. Pottage was a kind of thick stew, or soup. Meat, rare, perhaps a scrap of bacon rind, or a bone with no meat left on it. Sometimes a single sausage would be sliced thin, each family member getting a coin-sized taste. Eggs, only if the hens were laying, and not being taxed by the local lord. Bread was coarse and dark, and if times were lean, as they so often were, the bread might be stretched with sawdust. Yes, real sawdust, or clay. In winter, food could become dangerously scarce. Children learned early not to ask for seconds. But there was also community here. Villagers helped each other, sharing what little they had. Still, illness lingered in every bowl. And yet, families gathered each evening around the same pot. So imagine now you are there, hunched near the hearth, holding a rough wooden spoon. It is not a meal you would crave. Breathe slowly. Let your mind wander. In our next segment we step into a different world entirely. Behind the heavy doors of the castle kitchen, to see how the wealthy ate, and why their feasts could be deadly. Now the chill of the peasant's cottage fades. We are in a castle kitchen, a medieval marvel, a chaotic kingdom within stone walls. At first glance, this place should inspire envy. Great hunks of meat roast on iron spits, turned by tired young boys, or, in wealthier castles, by animal-powered treadmills. But look closer. The meat is not fresh, not in the modern sense. There is no refrigeration. And then, the sauces. Noble kitchens were awash in sauces, thick, rich, overspiced, and often heavily vined. This was not for subtlety or flair. The wealthy adored spices, cloves, cinnamon, pepper, saffron, precious powders brought by caravan or ship, worth their weight in gold, and dairy. Oh, the dangers of dairy. Milk soured quickly. Cheese grew moldy. Butter went rancid. You see, the rich had access to everything, except safe storage. Castles were drafty and damp. Pantries were dark and cool, but not cold. And yet the feasting continued. Servants sliced, roasted, boiled, and baked from dawn until nightfall. And the guests ate with their fingers, a knife, perhaps, for carving, but forks were rare and viewed as fussy. But worst of all, food safety didn't exist. No one understood bacteria. The result, the rich were often sick, not from poison, though that happened too, but from their own excess. And yet the banquets went on. Music played. Laughter rang off the stone walls. Platters were carried in with ceremony and flair. Wine was poured. It was a strange world of abundance and rot, of flavor and filth. Now imagine the candlelight flickering over a high table. Breathe slowly. The feast fades now. Next, we leave the noise of the great hall and slip into the shadowy alleys of a medieval town, where markets bustled with danger, and every bite came with risk. The feasting halls are now far behind us, and with them the illusion of grandeur. The clink of goblets, the smell of roasted fowl, the glint of candlelight on silver faded, like a dream that turned sour in the morning. The air is colder. It smells of damp straw, manure, and rotting turnips. We are now outside. We're in a medieval town marketplace, and it's not the romantic bustle one might imagine. There's no pavement, just packed earth animal dung, and whatever the night's rain hasn't washed away. Waste flows openly in shallow trenches beside the stalls. Grey water from kitchens, urine, blood from butchering, even human waste from chamber pots emptied from upstairs windows. This is not a place of cheerful merchants and fresh produce. This is a place of shouting, swindling, and stink. Look around. The ground is mud, churned by hooves and bare feet. There's no ice, only a dusting of salt, and that's not always fresh either. The scent is sharp and unmistakably wrong. Drinking it was always a gamble. They were often adulterated. Ground pepper might be mixed with crushed nutshells. Saffron could be dyed threads. You couldn't trust color, scent, or even taste. Flies are everywhere. You pass his wares lie exposed on a slanted wooden plank. The fish have dull eyes and open mouths. Some are already curling with and no one truly understood why illness followed certain foods. In London, you weren't supposed to sell meat more than a day old. Bakers could be punished for false weights. Market inspectors existed, but they were few, poorly paid, and often bribed. They blamed humors, curses, or foul air, not salmonella, not E. coli, not the microorganisms swarming the meat hanging for too long in the sun. You bought what you could afford, and you cooked it quickly, or tried to. For many, it was a daily dance between hunger and illness. Some of it is intentional. Strong cheeses were prized, but some of it isn't. There's no packaging, no labels, but that didn't make it indulgent. Quite the opposite. It is long and bare, with a vaulted ceiling and narrow windows that let in only pale light. Wooden benches line both walls, with long tables where monks sit side by side. They do not speak. Their heads are bowed. It was humble, regulated, and bound tightly to the rule of Saint Benedict. Prayer, labor, and moderation, in all things including meals. His voice is the only sound soft echoing slightly in the quiet room as the others eat in silence. In its place, only the soft hum of a breeze and the murmur of distant church bells. But generally, a monk's diet was simple, nutritious, and repetitive. Lent, Advent, Ember Days, Saints' feast days. The calendar was filled with reminders to deny the body. For most, meat was forbidden, not just out of piety, but because it was seen as heating the body, stirring the passions, and disrupting the spiritual calm. Certain abbeys stretched the definition of no meat by building separate kitchens for sick monks who conveniently were ill quite often and required roast beef. Lavish meals were sometimes consumed behind closed doors while the rule was technically observed on paper, and to do it all in silence because conversation was not considered necessary. No grand feasts, no golden chalices, just the quiet hope that their humility in life, even at the table, would lead to peace in the next. And somewhere behind the stone walls, the bell will soon ring for vesper. Communication happened through glances, gestures, and a quiet, practiced rhythm of daily life, resting your thoughts beside the flickering firelight of centuries past. Fish, however, was allowed, and eaten often, especially on the many fasting days. A spoon, a wooden bowl, and the ever-present peasant supper. No refrigeration. A merchant might carve a slice and hand it to a child with filthy fingers. Next, a butcher's stall. Pigs' heads hang from rusty hooks, teeth bared in frozen grimaces. These might include bread baked on site from monastery milled grain vegetable soup or some cheese or eggs, and perhaps a piece of salted fish, all consumed in quiet, with no seasoning except salt, and perhaps the faint flavor of herbs from the garden. A skinned sheep carcass hangs beside them, gray at the edges. The flies, the smells, the shouting at, all softens into silence now, as we enter another world entirely. Blood pools on the ground. There are no gloves, no aprons, no soap. They brewed ale, grew legumes, and raised bees for honey. The self-sufficiency of a monastery allowed them a kind of stability and access to food that many peasants could only dream of. The path underfoot becomes smoother, worn by centuries of sandaled feet. We are approaching a monastery, tucked away on the edge of a medieval countryside. Here, the chaos of the outside world gives way to something else. Order, rhythm, discipline. The butcher wipes his hands on his tunic between transactions. You pass baskets of fruit, some fresh, some mottled with bruises and mold, apples with worms, pears beginning to collapse inward. You see bread, of course, the staple of every meal. But even this is suspect. It's made with inconsistent flour, sometimes stretched with sawdust, beans, or chalk to make it last longer. Some loaves have strange greenish spots, but for the poor, there's no alternative. Now, a cheese cellar. Heavy wheels of yellow and white on a splintered table. The smell is overwhelming. And then the milk, warm from the animal, ladled from a pail that's only ever been rinsed with water. If at all, milk spoiled fast, often before midday. Even herbs and spices, if you could afford them, were a risk. Disease hovered everywhere. The flies, the rats, the dirty hands, passing coin to coin. They were invisible agents of infection. City officials tried sometimes. There were laws, or attempts at them, and yet people came here every day. They had no choice. This was where food was found. There were no grocery stores, no plastic wrap or expiration dates. And as you imagine this place, still your mind, the noises begin to fade. The merchants shouting, the pigs squealing, the clatter of hoofbeats. You are no longer standing in the chaos. You're floating just above it, watching it from the quiet safety of sleep. Because in a moment, we'll turn down a quieter path. Toward the where food was ritual, structured, and surprisingly influential. Let the clamor of the filthy market fade behind us. Stone walls rise around us, and, unexpectedly, monasteries were some of the only places in medieval Europe where food could be consistently better, more abundant, and even thoughtfully prepared. Let's step inside, into the stone refectory, the dining hall of the monks. A single monk stands at a lectern, reading scripture or hagiographies aloud. But what are they eating? The answer depends on the time, the place, and the rules of the particular order. And there were many. Up to 150 days a year were devoted to some kind of fasting, meaning no meat, no dairy, sometimes just a single small meal at sundown. On ordinary days, a monk might eat 2 meals, one in the late morning, and one in the early evening. Still, monks were far from starving. Monasteries often had extensive gardens, orchards, granaries, fish ponds, and even vineyards. But it wasn't always so noble. Over time, some orders became wealthy. Still, the ideal, persistent. To eat simply, to work the land, to pray, to endure hunger when called to fast. Even in their deaths, monks were buried in simple habits, often in unmarked graves. And so the monk eats slowly, mindfully, The bread is torn, the soup is sipped, the reading continues. You, however, may stay here, because after monks, we'll move once more, this time back to the village hearth, to a part of endless leftovers. Imagine it, a narrow, low-ceilinged home, more hovel than house. Its walls are of wattle and daubed twigs, mud, and straw packed between wooden beams. The floor is little more than packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes, sometimes simply left bare. A single opening in the roof allows smoke to escape. Mostly, inside, there is no pantry, no larder, no cupboard full of neatly stacked plates or bundles of herbs tied prettily with twine. Instead, in the center of the room, hangs a large iron pot suspended over a small fire pit. It is dark with soot, crusted along its edges. The air smells of smoke, damp wool, and slowly cooking vegetables. A meal without edges, without clear beginning or end. Then came vegetables, usually whatever was grown nearby. Leeks, onions, parsnips, garlic if you were lucky, lentils or peas during a good season. There was the rhythm of stirring the pot in the evening, of passing around bowls carved from wood, of eating together by firelight before sleep. On feast days, a bit of meat or fat might be added, but more often, it was the same ladle of the same thing day in, day out. It could be reheated, added to, diluted, thickened, or completely transformed depending on what was available. Grains were carefully rationed. Families might subsist on stale bread soaked in broth, or gruel made with more water than oats. Hunger became a familiar ache. This part perhaps the only part in the householder's home to the medieval peasantess most enduring dish, pottage. Meat was a luxury taxed, preserved, and prioritized for the nobility. And even when a peasant family raised pigs or chickens, these were often owed to their lord as rent or tribute. Bits of yesterday's pottage, a spoonful of cold gruel, anything that wasn't spoiled went back in. But even then, the best cuts were long gone before a peasant ever saw the animal. Pottage was not a recipe, it was a strategy, a way of stretching nothing into something, sometimes even blood, added for protein, thickening, and color. These loaves were coarser, denser, and far more filling than the upper-class fare. Their loaves were often made from rye, barley, or even muslina, poor man's mix of whatever grains were cheap. These breads were hard, dark, and frequently riddled with chaff, sand, or even ground-up bean pods and weeds. They sometimes included bran left over from the sieving process. But not all bread was created equal. In fact, in the Middle Ages, bread itself told a story of class, survival, and silent desperation. There were even cases of bread being made with rotten rye, a dangerous practice that could result in ergot, a fungal contamination that caused seizures, hallucinations, and even death. In some areas, this was called St. Anthony's fire due to the burning sensations victims described. It often began with water and some kind of grain, barley, oats, or rye. Spices, out of reach. Herbs from the garden help with flavor, but more often the taste was simply what it was: earthy, bland, filling. On rare days, it might be enriched with a bone, or a scrap of meat left over from the lord's table more. The pot sat simmering for hours, sometimes days. Leftovers were never thrown away, were simply folded into the pot. Bread crusts. If the family had salt, it would be used sparingly. Punishments were swift, but so was starvation. In most medieval villages, individuals weren't allowed to bake their own bread freely. These discarded trenchers were given to the poor, sometimes through churches, sometimes simply left out. They were greasy, soaked in meat drippings, but for many beggars or they were the only form of charity they could count on. A mother feeding her children stale, hard bread, soaked in watery broth to soften it. A family scraping mold off the crust before slicing it. It was a currency of survival, a symbol of one's place in a system so rigid, so stratified, that even the crumbs were governed. A father waiting in line at the village oven, watching the baker take a portion of dough as payment for simply using the fire. They had to bring their dough to the manorial oven, pay a fee, and only then could they take it home. This was called the banal writer tax on baking. This was called manchat bread in later periods, but throughout the medieval centuries, it remained a highly refined product, often reserved for the upper crust, both literally and socially. Some meals were so tightly controlled that villagers were forbidden from using hand querns at home, under threat of fines or punishment. This bread was sifted, soft, and sometimes flavored with honey, milk, or spices. It was a delicacy and a statement. But that was the goal. To fill. A good bowl of pottage didn't need to taste good, it needed to sit heavy in the belly and get you through another cold day of work. In this way, pottage was a kind of edible endurance, a meal not of joy, but of survival. And yet, within this monotony, there was routine, there was comfort. Some variations did exist. Gruel, a thinner porridge of oats or barley, was common for breakfast or for those with weak stomachs. Interestingly, the poorer the household, the more vegetarian the diet. The few times a year when meat could be had, perhaps during slaughter season, or as a rare gifted, was a celebration. In winter, the pot grew thinner. Root vegetables disappeared. But still, the pot remained. And so did the peasant, clutching their wooden spoon, sitting beside the fire, listening to the wind rattle the thatch above. Bread, in the medieval world, was not just food, it was life. It was politics. It was control. For many, bread was the cornerstone of every meal, more reliable than meat, more sustaining than vegetables, and more filling than thin gruel or pottage. Let's begin at the top. The wealthy elite nobles, bishops, merchants with money to spare ate soft, white bread made from finely ground wheat flour. Down the social ladder, the story darkened. The middle classes, such as tradespeople or minor officials, often relied on mixed grain bread, sweet, blended with rye, oats, or barley, depending on what was available and affordable. For the peasants, however, bread was a daily reminder of their low status. But it gets worse. During poor harvests or harsh winters, millers and bakers were known to stretch dough with whatever they could find: sawdust, chalk, clay, or spoiled grain. But if the bread was so bad, because there was no choice. You see, the lord of the manor controlled the oven. Even grain itself was taxed. Peasants had to grind their grain at the lord's mill again, for a fee. So the very act of making bread was wrapped in layers of economic hardship, legal restriction, and social hierarchy. Now, imagine the hunger in a poor household during a harsh winter, and if you dared complain, too bad. Bread riots were rare, but they happened. In cities, when prices soared or shortages hit, hungry mobs sometimes stormed bakeries, accusing millers and merchants of hoarding or cheating. Yet even in such hunger there was custom. The trencher, a thick slab of stale bread used as a plate, was common among the wealthy, who would discard or donate it after the meal. In this way, even waste bread had a place in the social food chain. Bread was not merely food, so the next time you tear into a warm, fluffy slice of modern bread, consider its long ancestry one made not of butter and jam, but of dust, toil, and a little desperation. To modern minds, the word meat conjures warmth, protein, and plenty. But in medieval times, meat was a double-edged sword, both a symbol of power and a very real threat to the people who consumed it. For the wealthy, meat was everywhere, or at least it appeared to be. What wasn't eaten quickly had to be salted, smoked, or dried. Techniques that worked well but altered the flavor, texture, and quality dramatically. What remained was tough, overly salty, and prone to mold or contamination. Nobles boasted of lavish feasts with tables sagging under roasted boar, pheasant, goose, beef, and veal. Only the wealthy could afford them, and they were used not to enhance, but to disguise decay. A nobleman might dine on goose that had turned sour, slathered in saffron and ginger to cover the scent and color of rot. But looks were deceiving. In an age before refrigeration, spoilage was a constant enemy, and fresh meat was almost a myth outside of winter. It was often rabbit or foal, or bits of stringy mutton, long past its prime. There was no hiding its condition. They boiled it hard in stews or pottages, hoping the heat would kill whatever had begun to fester. People spoke of meat that walked in the night, a phrase for flesh so foul it seemed alive with worms. These shadow markets often operated outside city walls, away from prying eyes, but not far from the desperate and hungry. Monks were forbidden from eating meat from four-legged animals, a rule often bent through elaborate loopholes. Birds were fine, but rabbits were declared fish by some abbots to allow their consumption, and even where abstinence ruled, meat still crept in through gifts, exceptions, and feast days. Deaths from tainted meat were frequent, especially during festivals or in hot summers when meat turned within hours. These weren't for taste, but for camouflage. Slaughter was often seasonal. Animals were killed in the late fall, when the cold helped preserve their flesh. They relied on bones, boiled marrow, pig's feet, or the occasional dead animals scavenged in the wild. There are records of people eating cats, dogs, and rats during harsh winters. Hunger blurred the line between food and taboo. The double standard was as strong as the stench rising from the manor kitchens, but in a mix of mud, dung, fish, guts, and sweat. Wooden carts creaked as they rolled in on uneven cobblestones, carrying vegetables, salted meat, eels, bread, milk, and sometimes spoiled goods, disguised as edible. To mask this, especially when meat went a bit off, medieval cooks doused it in spices, vinegar. To have it, even when spoiled, meant you had wealth and connections. These open ditches, called canals, ran along the sides of streets and market stalls, sewers in all but name. To lack it meant your body bent to the rhythms of the field, your diet dictated by seasons and suffering. There are countless records of cheating. Grain sellers who used heavier stones hidden in their scales, bakers who hollowed out the middle of loaves to save flour, fishmongers who soaked old fish in vinegar or wine to suppress the smell of rot. And spices weren't just for flavor, they were power. Imported from as far as India, the Middle East, or North Africa, spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were prohibitively expensive. Others stuffed rotting poultry with aromatic herbs, hoping to lure a quick sale before the stench gave it away. Unsold cuts were passed off as yesterday's special, even if they buzzed with flies. Fishmongers hacked their catch on wooden tables, never cleaned, while cats circled and children watched white. Fish went bad quickly, and as the smell worsened, the prices dropped, meaning the poor often ate the worst cuts, already nearing spoilage. For them, meat was rare. Most town dwellers lived on cabbage, onions, leeks, and dried legumes. Bread made from mildewed grain sometimes triggered what we now believe was ergot poisoning, causing convulsions, hallucinations, and in some towns, mass panic blamed on witchcraft, or a monk selling cheese made in a monastic dairy, rumored to cure ailments or enhance fertility. These were rare, precious things, where survival was negotiated, one stale egg or crumbly loaf at a time, where gossip spread, deals were struck, and children learned to haggle before they could write their names. Butter was often yellowed and soft from the sun. Eggs might be days or weeks old, collected from coops where hens lived alongside lice, waste, and mold. It wasn't uncommon for a housewife to reach into her basket and pull out a loaf already nipped. And yet, people persisted they had to. But meat deception didn't end there. In marketplaces, butchers had tricks. Some would bleach old meat with lime, or rub it with ash to make it appear smoked. And the risks were real. Food poisoning wasn't fully understood, but it was common. There's even evidence that meat was sold illegally at night, when the smell was less noticeable and the dim light hid the discoloration. At the monastery table, meat took on another complexity. But what of the truly poor? For them, meat was a ghost, a rumor, not a reality. And yet, meat retained its power. A peasant could go years without seeing a haunch of venison, but a noble who turned his nose up at slightly turned goose was considered refined. In the end, meat in medieval times wasn't nourishment so while nobles filled their bellies with decaying luxury, peasants stared at bones in boiling pots and prayed for flavor. Because in the Middle Ages, even bad meat was better than none at all. If you had the misfortune of needing fresh food in a medieval town, your journey would likely lead you to the market square. A place that promised plenty, but often delivered chaos, decay, and disease. Forget the idea of clean rows of colorful produce. The medieval marketplace was a sensory overload, not in the modern, cheerful way. Under the shadow of timber-framed buildings, vendors shouted their wares through clouds of flies and dust. There were no refrigeration trucks, no sanitary inspectors, just humans trying to make a living, often stretching the definition of fresh as far as possible. The stench alone was overwhelming. Animal, offal, discarded scraps, and rotting produce mixed with human and animal waste that flowed through shallow gutters. Now imagine shopping for dinner in the middle of that. Many vendors were honest, but many more were not. And if you bought meat from a cart or stall, you likely brought it home quickly, not for fear of spoiling, but because rats might get to it first. Rats were everywhere. Fat from feasting on scraps, they scurried beneath stalls, nested in bread baskets, and chewed through grain sacks. Milk was sold in earthen jugs, but milkmaids watered it down or skimmed the cream for resale. Fruit and vegetables were seasonal. If you saw a bright red apple in winter, chances are it was waxed, painted, or simply imported, and long past its peak. And what of fish? Fish was both a staple and a curse. Eels, herring, and cod were everywhere, but freshness was rare. And yet, markets weren't just food stalls. They were the heartbeat of the town. You might find a spice merchant offering a single pouch of pepper for more than a peasant's weekly wage. Still, nothing escaped the risks. Diseases like dysentery and typhoid lurked beneath every wooden table. A single bad sausage could kill, and despite all of this, people came back every day, because for all its danger, the market was where food happened. It was loud, risky, and chaotic, but it was life. And for many in the medieval world, the market, no matter how foul, was still better than an empty table. Far from the noise of village markets and the chaos of manor kitchens, life inside a medieval monastery offered a different rhythm, one guided by prayer, silence, and surprisingly complex rules about food. But don't let the image of serenity fool you. The rule of St. Benedict, followed by many monasteries across Europe, required monks to eat only 2 meals a day, avoid meat from 4-legged animals, and practice regular fasting throughout the year. Medieval monks may have lived humbly, but their relationship with food was anything but simple. It begins with fasting. Not the trendy kind, but religiously enforced abstention. And during Lent, or other holy seasons, even those limited meals might be pared down to just bread, water, and boiled greens. That meant no breakfast, a light meal at midday, and perhaps another in the evening, depending on the abbey. But here's where things become complicated. And a little ironic. Monasteries, though founded on vows of poverty, often owned land, received donations, and had extensive kitchens. Some became wealthy over time, their dining evolving in subtle ways, and soon rules gave way to loopholes. In some places, cheese or stewed apples were served, especially in colder seasons. After hours of chanting and scripture, the bell tolls for refectory. The communal dining hall. For example, meat from 4-legged animals was forbidden, but birds and fish, perfectly allowed. Conversation was forbidden, and even requesting salt might require a series of hand gestures. The sign language of the cloister. This included gardening, baking, brewing, and preparing food for the monks, who prayed in shifts. As a result, the monastic diet, while limited in theory, often became surprisingly rich in flavor. Some brewed excellent honeyed beer or spiced wine, especially on feast days. Others made butter and soft cheeses, or cultivated apples for cider and vinegar. Monks grew skilled at raising poultry and farming eels, trout, and carp in monastic ponds. Fish became a staple, and not just the simple, grilled kind. Recipes survive for elaborate fish pies, seasoned stews, and spiced preparations, all done within the bounds of religious regulation. Meals of boiled cabbage, black bread, and water were eaten cold. Monks had food, warm halls, and access to supplies that peasants could only dream of. No fresh water after a few days. No guarantee of return. And when famine struck, it was often the monastery that fed the hungry. From almonries, offering crusts, and soup to passing beggars, the focus was humility, even in suffering. To eat simply was to resist temptation, not just of the flesh, but of the tongue, the stomach. And in wealthier monasteries, the monks didn't even cook. Lay brothers, non-ordained members of the community, handled most of the manual labor. The day might begin in silence. A monk rises in his cold cell before dawn, washes in icy water, and heads to chapel. The meal. Maybe lentil pottage, barley bread, and a cup of weak ale brewed by the abbey's own hands. Weak and sour, but safer than stored water. But a creaking cog or a compact merchant vessel, sails worn thin by storm and sun. And even then, many were infested with weevils, small, flower-loving beetles that hatched in the warm, dark corners of storage barrels. The goal wasn't taste, it was longevity. Properly stored, these biscuits could last for months, even years. The wind is biting, the wooden deck slick with brine, and the food, well, the food is little more than a daily exercise in endurance, but always in silence. Barrels of pork or beef, soaked in heavy brine, often turning gray and stringy. The salt preserved the flesh, but also leached it of flavor, leaving only a chewy, leathery substance that had to be boiled endlessly before eating. One monk read aloud from the scriptures as others ate with lowered eyes, sitting at long wooden benches, wait for the bugs to crawl out, then eat. Mold floated on the surface, slime collected near the bottom. Sailors often had no choice but to drink it anyway, holding their noses, closing their eyes. Yet even among this restraint, subtle luxuries crept in. Others carried salted fish, like dried herring, packed flat and sharp. Still others brought onions, garlic, and mustard seeds, not for flavor, but to cover the foul taste of spoiling food. Teeth loosened, wounds wouldn't heal, and limbs swelled with searing pain. Bread was damp, meat was cold, bellies growled. Many medieval sailors had no idea what caused it. They just knew that long voyages brought death, and dinner. Dinner was the same as breakfast, hard, dry, salty, and utterly without joy. Monasteries cultivated herb gardens full of parsley, sage, thyme, and mint, not just for medicine, but to season food. In places like Cluny or Westminster, the kitchens became legendary. Vast stone halls with chimneys high enough to swallow the smoke of whole oxen roasting. Though those meats were reserved for guests and feast days, but not all monks indulged. In stricter orders, like the Cistercians, food remained sparse and plain. When seas were rough, fires were dangerous, which meant days passed with no warm food, only hardtack, cold meat, and hope. Still, for the medieval poor, outside the monastery walls, even this restrained diet could seem rich. But fishing was unreliable, and storms could ruin even those small hopes. In this way, the monks' kitchens were both spiritual engines and lifelines, blending charity with survival. And even within the quiet stone walls, food, simple, seasoned, or sparse, became a thread connecting body to spirit, work to prayer, silence to sustenance. Imagine you're adrift at sea in the 14th century. Not on a grand galleon. Medieval seafaring was not glamorous. These were not pleasure voyages, but missions of survival, trade, exploration, or war, and meals had to withstand the harshest conditions imaginable. There were no refrigerators, and so the diet aboard a medieval ship was built around one dreadful, stubborn principle: preservation. The most common staples were salted meat, usually pork or beef, packed tightly in barrels of brine; hardtack, also called ship's biscuit, a rock-hard unleavened bread baked until dry as bone; dried peas or lentils, if available, often boiled into an indistinct mushy stew; and of course, ale. Let's begin with the infamous hut. These were thick, jaw-breaking slabs of flour and water, baked multiple times until every trace of moisture was gone. Unfortunately, they were nearly inedible. Sailors often had to soak them in water, ale, or stew, just to soften them enough to chew. Veteran sailors knew the trick: tap the biscuit hard on the table. Some, too hungry to wait, just crunched them down anyway, insects and all. Next came the salted meat, and boiled again, and again. Water, unfortunately, wasn't always plentiful enough to waste on cooking, and fresh meat was unheard of unless the voyage was still near shore, or involved hunting seabirds, turtles, or fish. Dried legumes, peas, beans, lentils, offered some nutrition, but required soaking and fire to cook. As for hydration, fresh water was stored in wooden barrels, where it quickly turned stale. This is why beer and ale were so important at sea. Even weak brews offered safety. Alcohol inhibited the growth of bacteria, and a small cask of sour ale was preferable to a mouthful of murky, stagnant water. Some ships carried wine or vinegar, especially on noble or ecclesiastical voyages, but no matter what you ate, scurvy lurked in the shadows. Caused by a lack of vitamin C, scurvy ravaged the gums and joints. Meals were eaten, squatting on deck, sometimes with bare fingers, as waves lashed the hull. Still, some sailors sang, some prayed, some stared into the fog and dreamed of roasted meat, crusty bread, and warm hearths far inland. The cold gnawed at their fingers. Rats squeaked in the hold, but it kept them alive. When we picture medieval nobility, our minds conjure up grand banquets, long wooden tables piled high with roasted meats, candied fruits, silver goblets overflowing with wine, and servants rushing to and fro under vaulted ceilings. And while those spectacles did happen, sometimes the reality of noble dining was far more complex, and far less glamorous than legend suggests. For the aristocracy, food was power, but it was also a precarious performance. It reflected wealth, piety, status, and sometimes terrible ignorance of nutrition. Let's start at the Great Hall, the central dining space of most castles and manor houses. A servant would carry in a salt cellar, a decorative bowl of salt, and place it carefully in front of the lord or lady of the house. The closer you sat to the salt, the more important you were. Those seated below the salt, further down the table, were of lesser status. Meals began with ceremony. Imported, expensive, and vital, both literally and symbolically. Now, let's peer into a typical noble feast, or perhaps a stuffed peacock, served in its own shimmering plumage. But, more commonly, the table would offer. Their presence signaled global connections, wealth, and sophistication, even if they overwhelmed the palate. A nobleman might coat or array rotten meat in cloves to hide the smell. Cooked greens were sometimes consumed, but fresh produce was associated with peasantry. He might serve sugar-drenched ginger roots to show he could afford sweet luxuries while his peasants boiled cabbage in silence. You might see roasted swan, its neck arched upright, feathers replaced after cooking for dramatic flair. Roasted venison or boar from the lord's private hunting grounds. Pies, not sweet pies as we know them, but savory pastries filled with pork, fish, eggs, or even eels, but a creamy mash of chicken, rice, milk, and almonds, cooked until smooth and pale. Delicate, expensive, and very fashionable. Chronic constipation was also widespread, thanks to low fiber intake and heavy, oily meats. You might be served a meat pie and a honey-coated fig on the same platter. Others classified beavers as fish, since they lived in water, and justified eating their tails during Lent. A roast pig with an apple in its mouth wasn't just dinner, it was a message. I am powerful. Imagine eating roast goose, almond paste, and mulled wine in candlelight, while your teeth ache from decay, your stomach cramps from indigestion, and your cook has just seasoned your stew with lead-based glaze from a fancy ceramic bowl. Grain shortages, war, and bad harvests spared few. Their diets may have been richer, but they were not immune to the chaos of the medieval food system. I have resources I can afford to waste. They had personal cooks, herb gardens, and recipe books, filled with elaborate instructions and vibrant food coloring made from ground plants or minerals, and scattered among the sacks of onions and barrels of dried peas. There's a quieter danger, not from thieves or pickpockets, but from the food itself. Flavors were layered without our modern notions of dessert. There were no inspectors, no barcodes, no ingredient lists, or sell-by dates. What you bought was only as safe as the vendor's honesty. And honesty was in short supply when mouths were hungry and profits thin. And the air carries the heavy scent of animals, smoke, and yesterday's rain. Stews, rich with fat, flavored with rare imported spices like cinnamon, ginger, and saffron. So, bakers often stretched their dough by mixing in cheaper, sometimes dangerous fillers. So they turned fish, sturgeon, pike, whale blubber, even eels were a favorite, shaped into pies or fried whole, and breads, white and refined for the elite, darker and coarser for their servants. A popular dish was blancmange, not the wobbly dessert you might be imagining. Sweet dishes often came alongside savory ones, with no separation between courses. But this display wasn't about personal taste, it was about power and pageantry. Rare spices imported from the East, pepper, cloves, mace, nutmeg, were wildly expensive. A herring with a sour smell could be soaked in vinegar or urine to kill off the worst bacteria, just enough to pass a casual sniff test. Spoiled sausages were dusted with pepper or coriander to hide the scent. Eggs were floated in water to see if they'd degone off, but many were still sold regardless. If a customer hesitated, a vendor might slice a piece and eat it right there, a performance of confidence, even if it led to sickness later. So, to make it last longer, sellers diluted it with water, then mixed in animal fat or chalk to restore its creamy look. Sometimes, curdled milk was sold as fresh, leading to food poisoning, especially dangerous for children. And yet, for all their show, nobles often ate poorly, not in quantity, but in nutrition. Their diets were extremely rich in meat and fat, low in fiber, and almost completely lacking in raw fruits or vegetables. Selling spoiled food meant surviving the week, even if it made someone else sick. This led to problems. With no hygiene standards, raw meat was handled with bare hands. Waste ran through the streets in open channels. Rats darted between barrels. Flies landed freely on fish, then bread, then the faces of children. Gout, a form of painful arthritis caused by excess uric acid, was so common among the upper class. It was known as the disease of kings. If it rang hollow, it might be stuffed with fillers. Inspectors known as ale-tasters and bread-weighers were appointed. A few vendors were pilloried, locked in wooden stocks with their bad goods hung around their necks as a warning. Despite that, the aristocracy remained convinced that their meals were superior. You bought what you could afford, and hoped it wouldn't sicken your children. Some substances cause mouth sores, others slowly poisoned the body. To us it all seems excessive, even grotesque. But within that grand hall, every dish was a statement. But not every day was a banquet. On fast days, especially during Lent, nobles had to abstain from meat, or rather, from land animals. The church dictated what could be eaten and when, but wealth always found a loophole. Some noble households kept fish ponds on their estate to ensure a ready supply of religiously appropriate food. It was a strange balance, gluttony and ritual, indulgence and piety, and though their meals were abundant, they weren't always satisfied. Wealth bought extravagance, not necessarily health. And when famine struck, as it often did, even nobles found their tables bare. As the fire crackles and you drift deeper into this quiet corner of the past, remember this. In medieval times, eating well didn't always mean eating wisely. Picture a bustling medieval marketplace at dawn. The cobbled streets are wet with morning dew, vendors are already shouting in hoarse voices, wooden carts creak, mud squelches underfoot. In the Middle Ages, food fraud was not just common, it was expected. Let's begin with the bakers. Bread was the daily staple of nearly every medieval person, peasant or noble, young or old. But flour was expensive, and demand never ceased. Chalk, ground-up bones, clay sawdust, even powdered lime. These additives gave the illusion of bulk, but they made the bread gritty, tasteless, and hard to digest. And yet, these loaves sat proudly in baskets, wrapped in linen or displayed on wooden stalls, as if they were honest, fair. Then there were the butchers and fishermen. Without refrigeration, fresh meat had a very short window before it began to spoil, especially in warm weather. So clever sellers resorted to tricks. A side of pork starting to turn green might be rubbed with charcoal dust to mask the discoloration. Blood was often added to make old cuts seem fresher. In the cheese stalls, moldy wheels were scraped and reshaped, and perhaps most chilling, milk. It spoiled quickly, even in cool climates. These tricks weren't just born of greed, they came from desperation. A bad harvest meant months without income. A failed batch could be ruinous. Markets were chaotic, loud, crowded. Vermin and disease were constants. And yet, food was bought, shared, eaten. Life went on. Occasionally, laws were passed to stop these abuses. In London, assizes of bread set limits on what could be added to loaves. But punishment was rare. Enforcement was lax, and sellers adapted. If you were a savvy shopper, you learned to test for tricks. Tap a loaf. Smell the fish's eyes. Cloudy meant old. Check the cheese for crawling things. Taste the ale before buying. Still, even the most careful buyer couldn't avoid every danger. And for the poor, there were few choices. It was a world of risk, hidden beneath the ordinary act of eating. So as you lie there now, wrapped in blankets and listening to the fire's low crackle, imagine walking that muddy lane, clutching a crust of bread, sniffing at a wedge of cheese, weighing your copper coins and your trust. Imagine waking up just after dawn in a medieval town. The streets are still damp from the night's fog. The air is thick with smoke, rot, and the distant clatter of carts over cobblestones. You pull your cloak tightly around your shoulders. It's cold, and your stomach is already growling. The houses lean inward above you, their upper floors practically touching. Barking voices, squawking birds, the lowing of livestock, bells, wooden wheels, creaking, but mostly shouting. Rainwater trickles from roofs. Rats dart across your path. Today, like most days, you must go to market. Now breathe deeply, and imagine the slow walk down a narrow crooked lane. As you approach the main square, the sounds begin to swell. The medieval marketplace was chaos, and it was where almost all food was bought and sold, whether by townspeople, innkeepers, or noble house stewards. But the bread is coarse, filled with bran and husks, maybe even powdered chalk to stretch the flour. White bread exists, but it's expensive, reserved for clergy and nobility. Let's picture the scene. You pass a baker's stall, warm loaves stacked high. No inspectors, no refrigeration, no hygiene. Bribes were common, and most sellers operated freely. Next, a butcher's block. No, I say, Some cities employed alcanas who would taste and inspect local beer to ensure it wasn't too overly watered down or dangerously brewed. Bread weights were occasionally checked to prevent bakers from shorting customers. No refrigeration, just hunks of raw meat dangling on iron hooks. Flies gather. The smell is overpowering. Blood, fat, decay. The butcher swats lazily with a cloth. If you're lucky, you might get something fresh, but often, what's left has turned gray. But, as a daily, dangerous necessity, they ate because they had to, and often because they feared starvation more than infection. You move on. A fishmonger's table, slabs of eel, cod and herring laid out on damp boards. Salted fish is common, since it can be preserved. But fresh fish, risky, it spoils fast. It wasn't even just survival. It was a deeply spiritual matter. There were no trusted brands or expiration dates. You simply bought what looked least suspicious, and hoped it wouldn't make you sick. Food was sourced from the same markets, stored in the same conditions, cooked in open kitchens, carried across filthy streets. In the medieval world, it was a spiritual obligation, and if it smells too strong, sellers might try to mask the odor with vinegar or spices that on top of dozens of feast days honoring saints, many of which also included partial or full fasts. You pass a fruit cart, apples with brown spots, pears already going soft, insects crawling over bruised skins. Others dyed spoiled meat with saffron or wine to make it appear fresh. Eggs were sold past their prime. Milk was often watered down. There's no way to store produce properly. Most fruit is overripe or underripe, and sold anyway. This is the norm. People were expected to subsist on bread, vegetables, fish, and pulses. In theory, it was a time for spiritual cleansing, modesty, and reflection. Food fraud was rampant. Merchants often used tricks to disguise poor quality goods. Some added chalk or lime to flour. Fish is fine because it swims. It doesn't count as meat. It's important to remember. No labeling laws. The burden was on you, the buyer, to inspect everything. And if you got sick, that was your problem. Even barnacle geese, whose nesting habits were mysterious, were considered by some to be part fish, and thus fast appropriate. Sometimes the towns did try to intervene, but to medieval minds, it was deadly serious. But enforcement was uneven. Let's pause for a moment and imagine the sheer sensory weight of the medieval market. The smells: animal dung, smoke, rotting fruit, dried herbs, spiced wine, and human sweat. In some places, the demand for fish is so high that prices soar. The sounds: shouting, merchants, squabbling, hens, metal pans, someone playing a lute nearby. Badly. A well-fed household showed its strength. Nobles competed over lavishness. Banquets were political, every course a performance, but acceptable to God. And the visuals: a tapestry of filth and color, crimson meat, brown mud, yellow hay, stained aprons, fluttering cloth banners, and the endless gray of medieval stone. A dinner might start with bread blessed by a priest. Fish might be served in the shape of crosses. Certain herbs like bitter greens were included to reflect biblical themes of suffering. Food wasn't just hard to get. Now, take a moment to reflect on what this meant for daily life. Every meal came with risk. No meat. But they had access to fine fish, dairy substitutes made from almonds, and vegetable stews thick with flavor. And when food made people sick, which it often did, there were no antibiotics, no reliable medicine, just prayers, herbs, and bed rest. Cold stone walls. A bell rings. Monks file in. They produced their own food: baked bread, brewed ale, raised livestock, kept herb gardens, and some, especially Benedictine houses, ate surprisingly well. They sit. A single reader recites scripture while they eat, heads bowed, candlelight flickering in high-arched windows, and they often hit hardest among the poorest, who had the least food to begin with, but still faced the same religious expectations. People didn't eat for pleasure. Even the wealthier classes, who sent servants to shop for them, were not immune. Whether rich or poor, if you ate, you rolled the dice. So as you drift off, listening to the quiet sounds of the fire, picture the medieval market not as a quaint curiosity, a place of noise, deception, and survival. Not a place to linger, but a place to navigate quickly and carefully. And then, If you were lucky, you'd return home with something edible, and your stomach still intact. Close your eyes and take a slow breath. Imagine living in a world where when you ate, what you ate, and how you ate were dictated not by appetite, but by the church. In medieval Europe, food wasn't just fuel. Your plate, humble or lavish, was watched over not just by lords and kings, but by the church, and by extension, by God. Let's ease into this world of holy hunger. Fasting the rule, not the exception in modern times. Fasting might be a lifestyle trend. The church calendar was packed with days of restriction. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were often designated as fasting days, particularly Fridays, which commemorated the crucifixion of Christ. Then came Lent, a full 40 days of fasting before Easter and Advent. The weeks leading to Christmas often carried similar rules. So what did fasting actually mean? It didn't usually mean no food at all, though full fasts were occasionally practiced in monasteries or by extreme ascetics. More commonly, it meant no meat, no animal fats, and sometimes even no dairy or eggs. But in practice, well, people got creative. Fishy loopholes. Let's say it's a Friday in Lent. You're not allowed to eat pork or beef, but fish. So what happens? Fish becomes an industry. Monasteries own fish ponds. Nobles build elaborate kitchens with specialized tools for cooking fish dishes. In coastal regions, herring becomes king. Inland, people rely on salted cod, pickled eel, and dried haddock. Not always tasty. But this fish loophole is just the beginning. Some people argued that beavers could be eaten during fasts because they lived in water and had tails like fish. It sounds absurd now. Breaking a fast wasn't just bad etiquette, it was a sin. Something that could stain your soul. Feasts for the few now swing to the other extreme. Feasting, not everyday overeating, but enormous, ritualistic, excessive celebration, was largely reserved for the wealthy. Think dozens of dishes, roasted swans, spiced pies, sugar sculptures, and meat served in gilded armor or fake skins to mimic wild boars. Feasts were displays of power, not just wealth, but the church still loomed. Feasts often followed fasts, with elaborate religious rituals, prayers, and symbolism woven into the courses. This wasn't just eating, it was a moral theater, and sometimes an uncomfortable one. While the poor scraped together crusts and bitter greens, monks and bishops feasted on roasted capons and almond milk custards, all technically within the rules of fasting, but far from the spirit of abstinence. Monks, food, and forbidden pleasures. Let's walk now into a monastery. Meals here are eaten in silence, but don't be fooled into thinking monastic meals were always austere. Monasteries were often wealthy. On fast days, they followed the letter of the law. A common joke among medieval peasants was that monks fasted more lavishly than the poor feasted, and in many cases it was true. Food as moral compass, so imagine yourself again in this world. You're not just deciding what to eat. You're navigating a moral minefield. Is this meal sinful? Have I broken a fast? Is eating well a sign of God's blessing? Or my own gluttony? These questions shaped daily life. Hunger was not just a physical condition. It was spiritual, ethical, political, and in many cases, inescapable. Let your breath slow. Sink deeper into stillness. We've wandered through meager kitchens, rotten markets, smoky halls, and bitter monastery meals. We've met peasants who prayed for pottage, nobles who poisoned themselves with spoiled meats, and monks who fasted with full bellies. Now, we close with a quieter idea. Not about what people ate, but what food meant to their minds. Because in the Middle Ages, hunger wasn't just a physical pain. It was emotional, spiritual, cultural, and for many, it was permanent. A world of uncertainty. The average medieval person did not think of food in terms of choices. There was no grocery store. That your stored grain wouldn't mold. That winter wouldn't last too long. No pantry. No food pyramid. No scheduled dinner hour. And so they grew into adults who viewed food with a strange mix of gratitude, guilt, and dread. There was only hope. That the harvest wouldn't fail. That the Lord wouldn't raise taxes. This uncertainty ate at people. Even in years of plenty, they remembered the years of famine. Children were taught that hunger was normal, that it was part of life. Even a kind of spiritual trial, feast and fear, even a full table could feel haunted. So, even when the stew was warm, and the bread was thick, and the cider sweet, there was a shadow hanging over it. For the rich, banquets were never entirely joyful. there was always the lurking fear of poisoning, indigestion, or divine judgment for excess. For the poor, a good meal could feel like temptation, a taste of something they weren't meant to have. People feared gluttony as much as they feared famine. The church told them that to eat well was a sin, that the belly was dangerous, that too much pleasure led to corruption. This emotional strain, this constant internal dialogue of "do I deserve this?" left deep marks. The hungry soul, it was to live with a constant reminder that your life and your death might be decided by grain prices, weather, or the favor of someone richer than you. We often think of history in terms of war and kings, but for most people, history lived in the gut. In the quiet hours between fieldwork and prayer, in the long, hungry winter nights when children cried and mothers whispered songs to distract them from their empty stomachs, in the silent gratitude for a turnip, or a crust of cheese, or a spoonful of something warm, in the idea of good and bad food, in the way we reward or punish ourselves with meals. This wasn't just survival, it was identity, and over generations, it shaped a culture of resilience, but also one of trauma, of low expectations, of internalized suffering. To be poor in the Middle Ages wasn't just to lack money, and no matter how spiritual or faithful or hard-working you were, the hunger still came. The feasting halls are quiet, safe. May your dreams be gentler than your ancestors' meals, still, and finally, full. The monks are still, the ovens are cold, echoes in the present, and so, as you drift now into sleep, know that this story isn't just medieval. The way we think about food, about worth, indulgence, control, guilt, and need, is still shaped by that long, hard history. Even now traces of that fear linger in our language, our habits, our rituals. The ghosts of the hungry still whisper, quietly, but constantly. So let this story now fall silent. Let the embers of the fireplace fade into darkness. The peasants have gone to sleep, and you are full of knowledge. Good night.